am delighted to introduce today's webinar. The Magenta book, which focuses on government evaluation users and their needs, is a widely used reference for anyone working in evaluation. And we know that we have a lot of people, not only from government, but from the private sector and from NGOs joining us today. This updated version was published in April this year. And today we welcome the team from the Cross-Government Evaluation Group who authored the update. And the team is chaired by Stephen Finch from the Department for Transport. We will have about 30 minutes presentation, followed by Q&A. Please put yourself, and I think a lot of you have already, on mute. Please use the chat channel, which is on the bottom icon here. You can find it, the chat channel, to everyone, or to me, Bridget Dillon, whichever you want, to put your questions, and we will call on you in the Q&A session. Please do that during the presentation. So without more ado, and a big welcome to the cross-government evaluation team, over to you, Stephen.
Thank you very much, Bridget, and thank you very much for inviting us, and thank you everyone for attending. It's really good to have such a great attendance. Can we have the slides, please, Tim? Great, thank you. So I'm representing with my 4 colleagues the Cross-Government Evaluation Group. We're a group of analysts from various government bodies who are each responsible for evaluation and who get together for various evaluation development activities, most notably this update of the Magenta book, the 2020 update, which my fellow presenters were authors of. Next slide, please. So I'm head of evaluation at the Department of Transport. I'll start off by saying I'm the first of 5 speakers today. I'll start off by saying what the evaluation, the Magenta book is, why we think we need it, why we've updated it, and what's different about it. So what is the Magenta book? This is a reasonably long-standing UK government guide on evaluation. It covers why evaluation is important, conducting and managing and commissioning evaluations, published by the Treasury, and accompanies other analytical guidance, most notably the Green Book and the Aqua books, and also provides supplementary guidance on particular evaluation approaches. Next, please. Why we need this? Well, it really is helpful to us as government analysts to have guidance which we can share internally with our analyst and policy professionals, but also externally with contractors and other people involved in the government evaluation work. And this is to help build evaluation into interventions, design and delivery. And we're always trying to do that, and we're always trying to do that early, so that we can obtain good quality evaluation evidence, to better target interventions, to reduce delivery risk, to maximise the chance of achieving desired objectives, and to increase our understanding of what works. And this is of growing importance in government, particularly in terms of delivering value from public spending and demonstrating how we're improving outcomes for citizens. And there's a lot of focus on that at the moment as we move towards a spending review. Next, please. So why did we update it? Well, we've been wanting to update it for a few years now. Main reason, to add in new and innovative data collection and evaluation methods which have gained popularity since the last edition in 2011, particularly around the area of theory-based evaluation. Secondly, to inform a changing culture on evaluation in government, which includes a number of other initiatives, such as the push for experimentation, the growth of the What Works network through the Cabinet Office, and the Trial Advice Panel, which provides advice to particular government evaluations on the particular approaches. And it's also to inform the cross-government agenda on strategic outcomes and measuring their impacts, which will loom large in the coming spending review. And finally, there was an update of the Green Book in 2018. There's another one underway now, but to align ourselves with the updated evaluation content in that, which we as a team fed into. Next. So what's different this time? Well, please do look at it. The documents are online. We hope you'll find they're shorter and simpler than before. We've particularly wanted to ensure that different evaluation methods are viewed as having equal value. So building in theory-based impact evaluation approaches alongside experimental impact evaluation approaches. Also to provide a definitive voice on the use of key evaluation terminology, and more detail about that later. And to provide an annex of a range of evaluation methods, really to be an authoritative source where government analysts and people involved in government evaluations can come for definitions of these approaches. And finally, to provide new supplementary guidance, we've got what we hope is a more sustainable format this time, which has a number of additional items in annexes, and we hope to expand those annexes in future. That's all I'm going to say by way of introduction. I'm now going to hand over to Mike Davey, who'll cover the next section.
Thank you. I'm going to spend most of my slot talking about chapters 1 and 2 on planning and scoping evaluations, but I will say something about management and dissemination as well. So I'd hope that a lot of people will be familiar with this sort of material, the idea of there being a policy cycle and different types of evaluation. But I want to pick out a few key points on this. Firstly, something to say is that there are a number of different ways of describing these concepts. And in particular, I've seen a number of different versions of what a policy cycle should look like. We align with the Green Book in using the ROMEF cycle. I'm sure other people will have their own preferences, but I think the basic concepts are all the same, always the same. Second point I want to bring out here, which I will enlarge on in the next few minutes, is that the balance between different types of evaluation will vary from case to case. A good thorough evaluation will usually have some elements of process and impact and value for money evaluation in them, but the balance may change from one to another. And just finally, to underline the final point on this slide, that we should be thinking about evaluation throughout. It's not something where you consider the rationale and the objectives, you do your appraisal, and only then do you start thinking about the evaluation. And certainly one thing I've found in the past is that thinking about how you're going to evaluate the success of a program is very often helpful in concentrating people's minds on defining the objectives of your intervention more exactly. Next slide, please. So this diagram is our attempt to represent the overall evaluation planning process. First thing I'd like to emphasize on this is that we see a good evaluation as being one that's useful, one that's credible, one that's robust, and one that's proportionate. And there's no one-size-fits-all approach, and one thing which is always difficult when putting together evaluation guidance is it's not a simple algorithm where you can say, this is my situation, and that will automatically tell you what your evaluation approach is. It's imperative that you undertake the planning of an evaluation in collaboration with your policy stakeholders, of whom there may be very many, if you want to make sure that your evaluation is useful and used. Another thing I'd like to draw your attention to is that there are some loops in here and some two-way relationships. You could actually have a lot more in there, but the key message is that throughout the lifetime of evaluation, you need to be aware of the earlier stages that you've gone through and be prepared to go back to them if necessary. And I'll elaborate on that in a little bit. But let's start with let's go into more detail on the scoping, which is the stage in the box at the top. If I could have the next slide, please. So when we think about scoping and evaluation, the first thing which you should never underestimate is the need to understand what it is that we're evaluating. Not just what it is, but what it's aiming to achieve and how it's expected to reach those objectives. What we develop from this is a theory of change, which I'm sure will be familiar to a lot of people, including a summary of existing evidence. One of the things which I think is different in the current version of the Magenta book is there's more emphasis on the need to develop a good theory of change and some useful material in chapter 2 of the book on how to go about that, which I'm not going to go into now. Once you're armed with that understanding of what it is that we are trying to evaluate, then you can start to explore the evaluation needs and the purpose of the evaluation, which among other things goes back to the point I made about the balance between process and impact and value for money. So in some cases, we might have an intervention which we know to be effective and to be good value from previous evaluations. But what we really want from our current evaluation is to understand how it could be made more effective, in which case we'll probably put more emphasis on the process evaluation. In another case, we might have an intervention for which we've got a very strong evidence base on how and why it works and for whom it works, but what we really need is some very robust evidence on the value for money to inform decisions about whether we can invest in expanding it. So you need to reach that balance for the individual case. And all of this is an iterative process. It's although we number it 1, 2, 3, what you'll find is that when you start to tease out the evaluation questions, you may well find that your understanding of the intervention wasn't quite right, and you need to go back to that. And when you start talking to your stakeholders about evaluation processes and what they can and can't do, you may discover that your understanding of their priorities was not quite right again, and you need to go back and adjust those. So that's why in the previous diagram we had the dotted lines between these three activities rather than presenting them as a list. Then once we've done all that and we've got our agreed theory of change, this incorporates the existing evidence that we have. We've got an understanding of which parts of it we particularly want new evidence on. We're now in a position to go forward with choosing the approach, which Tim is going to talk about in a minute. But before I move on, just a plea. Once you've got your theory of change, don't put it away in the drawer. You'll need to refer to it as you develop your more detailed plans. And also you may well find that as you collect evidence going through the evaluation, you need to go back and refine or alter it. The next slide, please. So before we move on to Tim's exciting bit about methods and approaches, I'm going to say a little bit about managing an evaluation and dissemination. Not a great deal. The fact that we're not spending a lot of time on this, though, in this presentation because of the time constraints, doesn't mean that it's unimportant. The one thing that I would emphasize particularly from here is the need to have strong stakeholder engagement throughout. We need to make sure that our understanding of the intervention purpose and context is still right, because however careful we are, things do change, like the timing of key decision points. And we may need stakeholders who are fully engaged to help us with access to data or to research subjects or to additional resources. Next slide, please. And finally, we will need our stakeholders to be fully involved in the dissemination activities to help us sell the evaluation to the people who need to see it and to help us get the attention of the key people. And the one single point, that if you take anything away from this slide, is that evaluations are only useful if they're used. However good your methodology, however eloquent your reporting. If nobody reads it and acts on it, then you probably might as well not have bothered. So with that, I'll hand over to you, Tim.
Thanks, Mike. Just getting myself off mute there. Great, so I'm going to sort of carry on with that and continue the theme, focusing a little bit more on the types, approaches, and methods. And these are terms that we really spent a lot of time working through, thinking through what the implications of the terminology was. And I'll go into that in a bit, really sort of focusing on chapter 3 of the Magenta book, which is really about evaluation methods. And just to put in context of exactly what Mike was saying there around, this is a part of evaluation. Sometimes it's considered a bit too much of the focus of evaluation, the methodologies, but the management, the dissemination, the use, all of those things are critical steps. But this is a little bit, I suppose, of the USP of the evaluator, of understanding and implementing the methods. So after scoping, and very much in collaboration with stakeholders, as we kind of going to reiterate, we really need to think about what the most suitable evaluation method is. And we need to choose that carefully in terms of maybe making sure that we can answer the evaluation questions that have been set. We need to think, as others have said, about the proportionality, the effort and resources that are required, and the availability of data. We can have some great ideas about the methods we might use, but if the availability of data means that the process is going to be unaffordable, then it's really not going to work in terms of answering the questions that we need. Then there's also the timing of decision points. I think this is a really important one, that we're often focused, as Mike said, around the use of evaluation. What is the purpose? What are we trying to influence? If we can be clear about what decision points are coming up and who's likely to take those, then we can really sort of meet the needs of the stakeholders and make sure that the evaluation has an impact. And just to highlight there, the last point there, about more than one approach and method may be needed to answer all evaluation questions. And we'll come on to that, I think, in a second. But that's just to keep in mind that we need to, an evaluation question may have different perspectives and angles, and different stakeholders may have different angles and questions that they need to answer. So in terms of the methodologies to take forward that, and this is a diagram from the evaluation scoping in chapter 2, but it's really key, I think, in terms of thinking through how the types, approaches and methods really come together. So I'll just walk you through this a little bit. On the left-hand side there, we have the scoping process, defining the rationale of the intervention, what it aims to achieve and how, and the purpose of the evaluation. And this is where we talk about types of evaluation being process, impact, and value for money. And the evaluation questions that are really kind of become explicit in the scope. In the design section in the middle of this slide, we really think about the evaluation approaches. So this is much more about whether it's theory-based, experimental, quasi-experimental, or again, some more of those value for money approaches. We then think about the evaluation methods. So we've broken it down into those 3 layers. So these are the things that we often focus on, and the choice of these could depend, as it says there, in terms of a number of things: the resources, the time available, and those all sort of fit into the scoping stage. And Mike highlighted the iterative nature of the planning and implementation process. And then finally at the bottom we have there the sort of conduct. So that's the implementation, but it's also maybe, particularly for a sort of mixed methods approaches, it's also about synthesizing the outputs of those different streams of your evaluations and bringing those together, whether that's a meta-analysis or meta-evaluation or whatever. And on the right-hand side, if we can just sort of highlight that line going back through different stages of this process, where we need to use the evaluation evidence to inform action. So it's not just something that happens at the end where you go back and inform action. and policy, but that can happen throughout. And as Mike also said, like, we need to update the theory of change as we go through the process, and that takes us back right up to. One of the key things that we really wanted to highlight from this was, as Stephen said, sort of putting the theory-based approaches to impact evaluation alongside the experimental and quasi-experimental. So the ordering of actually the things in this slide have been carefully thought through. In terms of the methods there, you can see the sort of, it's not a comprehensive list of every method under the sun, but hopefully we've pulled out some of the ones that are particularly useful and particularly widely used across government, or we think are of particular value in the near future and will sort of become more popular probably. So we have things in terms of theory-based, we have realist evaluation and qualitative comparative analysis. We have things like process tracing and contribution analysis. Experimental, we have randomized controlled trial methods, and then quasi-experimental, various things around matching, timing of events, interrupted time series, etc. So what we have in chapter 3 is a little bit more detail in each of those areas. You can see again those are shown on the left-hand side. We've got research methods which may be used in both process and impact evaluations. We have theory-based, experimental, quasi-experimental, section on value for money methods, and then a section on synthesis methods. Where possible within each of those sections, we've tried to give, as it's shown on the right-hand side, we've tried to give a bit of an indication in terms of how to select them, what type of questions, the high-level questions that might help people think through what type of methods they would use within their evaluation approach. We've been able to do that for the experimental, quasi-experimental, and a little bit here for the synthesis methods, but we didn't think it was kind of the right time, or that we had the right information to actually be able to do that for theory-based impact of evaluation methods. There's much more of a discussion that is needed rather than maybe a relatively simple flowchart. Just quickly, finally, in Annex A, we also have a lot of work. Taryn led on a lot of this around the analytical methods for use within an evaluation. So we've got sort of one-pagers which provide a little bit more of the detail here around what is it, how it's used, and some of the pros and cons for those. So the Magenta book as a whole is, as Stephen said, a little bit slimmer this time. It's not really a sort of guidebook to the methodology of how to do these things, but we thought it was important to provide some of that in the annex. And so I'm going to hand over to Taryn next, who's going to talk about handling complexity.
Thanks, Tim. Hi, everyone. I'm Taryn McMillan, Head of Evaluation at the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, and I also sit with Tim and others on the UKS Council. So as Tim mentioned, I'm going to be talking about one of the supplementary guides which sit with the Magenta book, which is this handling complexity within evaluation. And the supplementary guide was actually written by the Centre for Evaluating Complexity across the Nexus. So they're industry leaders, if you like, in some of the thinking around some of these complexity aware approaches. So to give you a bit of an overview in terms of what actually sits in this quite long supplementary guide, it covers off a number of key points. First of all, actually, what complexity is and why it matters. When we talk about complexity where it comes to policy making might exist within our social world, it might exist within our economic, it might exist within our environmental, or all manner of different spheres. And it's actually the core concept of complexity is things not necessarily operating as we might expect. There might be some uncertainty in terms of what we see. Certainly within the world of DEFRA, where I undertake evaluation, a lot of the natural systems and natural processes which exist can be quite chaotic. They can happen and not happen in a sort of routine way. And that's specifically what this supplementary guide is around. Of course, where it comes to making policy, this poses a number of different challenges. There's all manner of socio-economic policies which are made, which try and handle this complexity around how we handle things not operating as we might expect. One of the ways and means that the guide helps users of the Magenta book to be able to navigate some of this complexity is first of all by giving what's presented on the slide here, so a series of properties of complex systems. So effectively ways to diagnose and understand complexity which might exist in whichever system we're talking about. We have concepts such as feedback, so positive and negative feedback. Things such as a stampede, for example, is an example of positive feedback. It's one action, it's one person walking and actually moving, but triggering action in others, so that there's a positive feedback. It's making whatever that change is be sort of increased and greater in impact than originally that first input. Equally, we have concepts like non-linearity. So again, something which develops and changes, but not in the ways that we might expect. And what the guide does in this first part of the guide is actually talks you through each of these different concepts of complex systems and enables you to help diagnose, understand those, and then start to think about how we handle them in evaluation. Can I have the next slide, please? So what it does talk about is some of the challenges which complexity can pose to evaluators. And critically, one of the key challenges that poses is having complexity, having these aspects or different parts of a system which might work in unexpected ways, is it makes it quite difficult to attribute causality, which is obviously a key concern of evaluation. And in essence, it provides a number of different ways and means to help think about that and how we can handle that, both in the methods that we use and actually how we set up and structure an evaluation. Two key resources which I'll just highlight here, which are presented on the slide, which are quite assistive in being able to pull that together. The first of all, we have on the bottom left the Stacey matrix. So this in essence is, as you can see, a graph which enables any initiative or intervention to be plotted against these two axes around where we have far from agreement or close to agreements around agreement, and actually certainty, close and far from certainty, and enables us to define to what extent what we're looking at, the policy area, the individual intervention, might be classified as simple, complicated, and complex. What you can see is that this starts to draw out implications for the types of methods and approaches that we might want to use in being able to evaluate. At the complex end, we might, for example, think about using systems or hybrid designs, or equally thinking a bit more about if we're lacking that agreement and we're quite complex in terms of saying what an intervention should deliver, actually being able to draw on co-design or collaborative approaches. What we also have on the right is something which myself and my team have led on working with CCAN, which is the DEFRA Complexity Evaluation Framework. This is a way in which the concepts of complex systems have really been carried through to give a number of commissioners of evaluations key considerations at each stage or element of designing an evaluation. So actually thinking about what do we need to know in understanding a particular intervention, what do we need to know in designing an evaluation, and what do we need to know where it comes to embedding and disseminating findings from that evaluation, and how do concepts of complexity factor into it there. So these are just sort of two key diagrams and ways and means that you might like to use to think about complexity a bit further. Next slide, please. Equally, we have a detailed annex. So Tim there mentioned the supplementary annex that sits detailing all methods. Within the supplementary guide, there's also a detailed annex which talks through each of the different methodological approaches which can be used to support different types of complexity which might happen within a system. Again, I'm not going to go through all of the different types of approaches, but what we have got is another example of the Stacey matrix here, which again talks about simple, complicated, and complex, and how you might bring in some of those different approaches, or how some of those different approaches might help you with some of those challenges that you might be having owing to complexity in thinking through an evaluation. So we'd highly recommend that you do direct your attention to that particular section to help understand the strengths and weaknesses of different methods and approaches in evaluating in complex situations. So that was all I wanted to say on the complexity, supplementary guide on complexity. I'm now going to hand over to Marianne Law.
Hi. So I hope everyone can hear me, but let me know if not. So I'm going to, could I have the next slide, please? I'm going to talk about the chapter in the Magenta book about evaluation capabilities, as well as the supplementary guidance to do with a capability framework for government analysts. So the capabilities chapter and the guidance describe the knowledge and skills which enable effective and high quality government evaluations. So these complement other relevant government guidance in the area of, for example, public sector equality duty, transparency guidance, ethics, publications guidance, also the HMT Green Book. And for this reason, the framework touches on issues relating to values, ethics, and personal qualities, but effectively these are covered by other ethical and competency frameworks. So it focuses primarily, as we'll see in a minute, on the similar contents of the rest of the Magenta book. And the framework is primarily a learning tool for government evaluators. So the focus and audience for the chapter and the annexes is the government evaluation project manager, who's typically an analyst in one of the main government analytical professions. Having said that, evaluators delivering evaluations for government will probably be interested in it too. And it's designed for analysts working in government departments, but other frameworks also exist. And as this is a UKES webinar, we should flag in particular the UK Evaluation Society Capabilities Framework and Self-Assessment, which covers much of the same content, but it applies to the full evaluation community in the UK, including evaluation commissioners. Next slide. So leading and managing an evaluation requires a lot of different skills, and the way that we've divided it is into 4 broad areas. So one area that we can look at is scoping. So as we've said previously, scoping and evaluation is a crucial step, and having the skills to understand the intervention and develop appropriate questions and approaches is really important. So in this section, we highlight skills around understanding the rationale for evaluation, constructing a theory of change, identifying the right evaluation approach, and producing a proportionate evaluation plan. Then we talk about leading and managing. So often evaluations in government are delivered in challenging and changing policy contexts, and this requires strong leadership and collaboration skills. So a number of skills are flagged in this chapter, and broadly they sit within areas of demonstrating leadership, working collaboratively and influencing stakeholders, adapting to changing circumstances, and displaying integrity and resilience. We then talk about methods and the skills required around evaluation approaches, data collection, analysis, and the methods have already been discussed in chapters 3 and 4 of the Magenta book, but here in the capabilities chapter and annexes, we bring that together, looking at monitoring and admin data, methods of primary research and analysis, impact evaluation methods, process evaluation, value for money, and research synthesis. And then finally, as we've said, as other speakers have said, that the value of an evaluation comes through its use and influence. So this is flagged in particular with respect to reporting and presenting data and considering policy implications and how to disseminate evaluation evidence. Next slide. This slide is really just a screenshot of the supplementary guidance. So the supplementary guidance includes a capability framework, and there are 2 products. There's a PowerPoint document which has the full list of skills, as well as resources and further reading for each of the sections. And there's also an Excel tool with a subset of questions which is designed for self-assessment. And like I said, although it's designed for government evaluators, it's likely to be of interest to a wider evaluation community.